I would say that most of your presentation was about the subject as unit of analysis, the human being. So you ask, for example, you distinguish, you say the first distinction is being born. And I think this has precisely been an issue between Schutz and Husserl, where Schutz says about Husserl that he makes it too abstract. As long as we are born from mother, from women, we are human beings first, while he says that Husserl wants to ground everything in communication. And I think this is, I don't agree with Schutz, but his point here is very clear. So from the perspective of taking communication as the unit of analysis and not the human being, the birth of the human being is morphogenesis. This is from Margaret Archer, it's just the history. What is meaningful is where the communication plays in. So it's the educational system, it's the mother-child relation as a discursive system, yeah, which brings in the social, and it is not the individual. And I also think that the focus on observation is, and you have the advantage, Luhmann is on your side, but I think this Luhmann 3, with this focus on observation, there is no observer in the society. Society has no ears, no eyes. It cannot observe. It is human beings who can observe. What society can do is process expectations.
Yes, and I hope I got that across in my own. I agree. Let's just say I agree. I think I understand what you mean. Yes.
It's a very beautiful passage from Husserl. I can get it and send it around. Schutz makes this point against Husserl.
But may I?
Sure.
Are you aware of the distinction Luhmann made in Das Recht der Gesellschaft between operative closure of the systems and cognitive openness?
Yes.
Which means that communicative systems are also made by cognitive elements that are coupled with communication and with the selections of communication. Okay, so
they're different. It's the same word. Luhmann says that too, that words have to be placed in relation to systems of reference. If you're talking about cognitive at the consciousness level, it's something else than cognitive at the communicative level.
Yeah, I agree. Okay.
May I show then another slide of someone that you didn't talk about, but I think belongs here. That was 1934, Karl Bucher, who also came up with a model of communication that that hasn't been mentioned, and he brings up also the issue of the text versus the spoken word, so the codified via computers or microphones or tape recorders versus the face-to-face communication. And it's an aside, but as you all know the story of Karl Bucher, because he was very successful in Vienna, and then he had to leave. His wife left in a different way. Yeah, than he did. Yeah, and she was able to continue her work. But when Karl Bucher came to the United States, he just had a private practice or something, but his work was totally ignored. And now, of course, people are doing an effort to bring it back. But Karl Bucher is the dissertation advisor of Karl Popper. That's the reason he shows up. And you could kind of see that there are containers at work if you want to, if you make distinctions and then you say, okay, we have here several containers and so we need to now figure out how they fit together.
So I mean, I think there are really basic problems. Can you put the Bucher?
Yes, I'll bring it back up.
There are really basic problems with these kinds of constructs where you don't have the individual psychological individuals with their own private meanings, and then also a theory of how private meanings get coordinated via communication and public meanings. In this one, the representation is completely outside of either the sender or the receiver, right? Whereas a constructivist psychologist like Piaget or I would say myself would say that the representations are inside the minds of both the sender and the receiver, and they're different. I think Pass could agree with that as well. And they get coordinated through communication and cooperation, actually concrete behaviors. So, much of Luhmann's framework can be rewritten in terms of, not in terms of these categories that are only existing at the social level, but through an interaction of individuals and the society or the community.
So Pete, yeah, go ahead.
I just think that this is where everything goes off the rails, and it gets into self-reference. He has a view of meaning that's not in the head, that's very vague because we can't observe communication. And it isn't grounded in anything. You can't have a social theory without some sort of conception of what the individual actors are doing. We couldn't explain what happened in the last 5 years, to our societies without some sort of theory of individual psychology and then mass psychology.
Yeah. So Peter, when you say he, do you mean Luhmann or Bucher? I'm
just pointing at that particular diagram by Bucher, but also Luhmann, it seems. And it comes from this sort of, I think comes indirectly from Marx and Hegel, who prioritized abstract categories over concrete individuals.
Okay.
And Hegel is an extremely bad starting point for any philosophy that wants to be clear.
I agree with that last point, but I don't agree with what you say. Luhmann has appreciation for the lower level of the interactions, but the issue is now that interaction is not to be reduced to the individuals interacting, but how interaction recursively operating on interaction builds up interaction systems. And Jamie has called that gestalt, but I would use the word configurations of interactions, which have mechanisms to stabilize and to globalize. And what I then would add, and that's also to Jamie, is Luhmann calls this the triumph of the Enlightenment. So it's not the triumph of the Enlightenment is that we can sustain that communication has become the driver of a cultural evolution by increasing complexity. For example, we can have coins to pay. We can first pay on the market in negotiations, then we can have coins, then we can have banknotes, then we can have credit systems, credit cards. We can get ever more complex communication systems, which make it possible for us to, for example, to buy globally. And these systems are the interesting thing. And they are not individually based. It's not a micro base.
They're grounded in the individual conception.
No, they are not. Precisely, that's the assumption. Let's leave those individuals for a moment out.
There is no possible way to coordinate private meanings with other private meanings. That is impossible.
No, may I
Conversation.
yeah.
Yes,
God
but,
needs
society is something more than a simple conversation. Okay.
We are in the middle of meaning generation, and I like to add a couple of things. Your computer screen is the object, and it's part of an event. And I'm the sender. We're all taking turns being the sender and the receiver. So you have to be people here. And then there is sound. And the sound is broken in this linguistic science. And so now he calls it expression. So maybe he could say arguing or something else, and appeal. We can have questions about that either, but he said there is something happening between that sound and the receiver. And here we get to the question of metaphors again, and negotiation of that private meaning through metaphors that we find out, are we using similar metaphors? Because representation, that is the sign as a picture metaphor in some way, like, or the sign as a drawing or whatever you want to call it, but the similarity between a photograph and the original, so that when we hear a certain sign, now this is just one metaphor. There are many other metaphors.
It's not iconic. It's in, you know, it's a symbol that, I mean, this is Saussure, right? That it doesn't have any arbitrary.
No, it's not Saussure. It is Peirce plus Popper, and it's definitely not Saussure. The object is an artifact, and that is, it's not changing. All of you see the same object, but what is very different is what you all make of the object and how you respond to it.
Yes.
And we have two choices, or three. We quit the conversation, we kill each other, or we negotiate. So, yeah.
Bernard, could you say something?
Oh, yes, exactly. It's negotiation. These are arguing behaviors. We're making noises. And Jason, if you suddenly started speaking Chinese, we'd have a struggle to understand you. We'd have to spend a long time negotiating with you about what on earth you were trying to say. There's a lovely story where Heinz von Förster says he was once observing a therapy session, and he was outside looking through a one-way mirror, and a family therapy session. And he turned the sound off, and he just amused himself by seeing all these human beings dancing around, making noises, obviously making noises, but it's, you know.
Negotiation, in my opinion, is the very primitive one.
Yes.
It's the interaction.
No.
For example, on the market, you may have to negotiate.
He does not invoke these codes. Somebody wrote a dictionary. Everything gets argued over. I've just been arguing with Peter.
Let me finish.
What computer means. I mean,
so, for example, if I gave the example of payment on the market, if you have to negotiate about the price, then you are in a very primitive situation. If you buy with your credit card, you're in an advanced situation. You're not talking to someone. You are mediated by all kinds of codified systems, which regulate how you behave and how you are able to achieve your purposes. So there is another system there, which is not us, which takes care, codes the communication.
that's just mechanical.
No, it's not just mechanical, it's social.
I
There's
have
a mechanical part to it too.
I have to say to the shopkeeper, do you take cards? He says, yes, but not American Express.
And I'm not talking about the shopkeeper, I'm talking about you filling out your card number because you want to buy something.
Well, that's like me getting in my car, wishing to drive somewhere. It's just a machine. It's a vehicle for me to get things done.
Yeah, there is a layer in those communications which is mechanic. And
Well,
there we need Shannon type of information. There we need Shannon's theory. But there's also a layer where meaning is generated, and that's not mechanic.
It's data processing. It's got nothing to do with meaning.
Well, I have a question for both three of you. I have a question for three of you. Did Luhmann make a distinction between communication and the conversation in Gordon Pask's sense?
I don't think you will find a reference to Pask,
So
which I think is a
no
pity.
distinction. So communication means including all the meaning changing dynamics and technical aspects.
I think even the technical aspects are pushed out by Luhmann.
I would
the
ask
definition
Bernard.
of information by Luhmann is wrong. I can give you the page number, and he thinks that information is a selection.
Mhm.
Well, information is variation, uncertainty, I would claim.
If I could interject as Lowell Christie, the founders of America were very clear. They made one essential distinction that gives clarity and counters what Peter is saying. They made a distinction between mind with a small m, meaning my mind, how I think, my prejudices, etc., and a capitalized M, meaning the mind of the culture or the mind of a people. And in their design of the American experiment, they understood the individual psychological stuff, and they said, that is not what controls a political environment or change or evolution of a society. It is dealing with the collective intelligence and interaction of the representation, i.e. through like voting, a collective idea. And that simple distinction was almost erased by editors when they published it by erasing the large capital. And it's only when you go back to the original writings that you see a major distinction that counters what Peter is saying. It's not just individual, it's a unique structure of the system of the big capital M mind that is where the regulator of the system occupies and where you design your experiments of governance.
Mhm.
I don't think that they spoke with one voice or one mind. And I don't know what is the mass psychology of the US at this point. You know, I don't think we think with one mind. There certainly are memes that are going around and being circulated, but there's no coherent organization to our mass psychology per se.
Peter, by saying mass psychology, you're still within the psychology set. They would have disagreed with the psychologization of society.
So who are you talking about in terms of the founders? Jefferson?
May I?
You have to be looking at the totality of the Republic of Letters embodied primarily in Jefferson, in Madison, and the Supreme Court justices in their original
Yeah,
right.
but the point is there.
That we don't need competing political parties. We don't need structures of checks and balances.
Why don't we need them? Why don't we need them?
What?
Why don't we need them?
We need them because there's a diversity.
We have them, and precisely what you're making is the point. In the late 18th century, people made those systems, not only in the United States, but also in France.
Yes.
But they
Yes.
conceptualized them as mind with a capital M. And nowadays, we know that it is no longer the case. These systems are not integrated. There's no center to it. It was more dramatic. And by the way, this point has, when you decapitate the king, then you remove the center. That was, this point is made by French philosophers like Derrida. Yeah. When one still had the idea that you could organize everything in a parliament or in Congress, that you can have everything represented there, that has broken up into functional differentiation. That's precisely the point where I think Luhmann is progressive. Leave that idea behind us and break it up.
But what is important about the founders in the Republic of Letters was they looked at the container, the boundary of the culture, and what based upon certain systems of interaction or conversations. So it's not a matter of whether we have a center or not, because they saw a distribution, a decentralized, distributed structure countering the, creating the antidotes to power, which was their design focus.
In Europe,
Yeah.
this took the place of Napoleon.
Yes,
This is
and
Napoleon, who wanted the universal idea. And fortunately, he lost the battle in Waterloo.
And what happened is the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The terms
Yes.
are very similar, you know, equality, liberté, fraternité, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Very similar. No, absolutely not, because they're based upon radically different truth functions. A truth function of absolute certainty in the French Revolution that propelled Napoleon, that propelled science, and Comte, who tried to reintroduce science through via looking at the principles of the French Revolution. And that's the science we have now. And the science we're trying to talk about now is a very descriptive, systems-oriented, not discrete, particle-oriented of an analytical science we have today. And the Americans were based upon a very different enlightenment from the Scotland, not from the continent.
Larry wants to say something.
Yeah, I want to go back to a question that Peter raised. I think it's relevant to this current interaction. Peter asked what grounds Luhmann or whoever's talking. And that's a question I have. What I see, what I assume, I can't find this directly in his readings, but what I assume is that he's a sociologist and he was interested in transforming sociology.
Yeah.
I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a scientist even. More of a designer,
sociologist.
even though I'd like the science to be more design oriented. You know, it's not currently. Science does require concrete objects. Currently, society is an abstraction. It's you can't touch it, can't feel it, yet it's very, very useful as a concept for us. And for me, what grounds me and why I find this topic of society so useful is some passions that I have. Passions for a society that's much more desirable than what we currently have. One that's, you know, I call it participative dialogic. And that then, if that's what grounds me, that leads to different kinds of conceptions and models and so forth that I bring forth in order to try to meet and address my passions. So when Lowell talks about you know, the origins of the United States and the Constitution, you know, there are aspects of what they did and what we now need to address that were intended to create a more desirable world.
Yeah, the point is, are you still a positivist? Because if you say it's objects which we need in science, that's a natural science background. In society, we can't do that because the objects are not there, the meanings are not there. What we can do is we can construct theories which we can test. Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of those objects, we can. So we have to leave, and there I side with Jamie. We have to leave behind this whole positivism and go for critical rationalism.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes,
I think the question that raises for me is, you know, is it useful? It can be useful, and ideas in general are useful, but I have a hard time really drawing from Luhmann things that are really, really useful to me and my passions.
I find it very useful.
May I try to give an example to Larry? I'm trying to I'm trying to share my screen. So what I'm showing you, and I got this via Karl Popper, is I show you two images. And so I'm talking in the abstract. I'm talking about society, but I'm even doing more. I'm talking about how society is visualized inside someone's human head. Now, what I'm doing is an ideal type of situation, a fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. But I have something on paper, and it's an object, and it won't change. All of you see the same thing. And so, and now we can start arguing about what does it mean, and is it even useful and relevant. But what I'm trying to show here is what Lowell was bringing up, I think, and also Luth in a way. So on the right, you have the great chain of being, that there's a fixed order with on top the king and the pope, and completely on top God, and then totally in the bottom the devil and hell and everything that's horrible. And that is a structure that you find all over, that is used to put people in their place, to say, don't try to get out of your box because something horrible will happen to you. And then there is enough literature to scare people to death if they want to believe it. And then that other structure, I think is maybe part of the Scottish Enlightenment or American Revolution. I don't know, but it's kind of say, okay, we're here together now, and let's just each use our strengths and work together to figure out what we're going to do next. And that approach on the left, that starts with acknowledging that all the stories about God, they came from a text and a Bible, and it was after the Protestants. So there was already a discussion of whether some people had changed something in the Bible, whether the Bible was actually completely altered and not really the original text. So people were open to be critical. So what I'm just trying to point out here is that the structure of the great chain of being is still very much around us. So that we're still in a struggle. I mean, it's not, we still need to negotiate, is what I'm trying to say.
I want
What
to
is-
add
what is
an example
interesting-
to Larry, because I owe him that. So I'm in science studies. So why are we interested in how do we make interdisciplinarity? How do we make synergy in university, industry, government relations? Those things can only be defined theoretically, and then we can develop measurement instruments for interdisciplinarity, for example. Diversity can be used as a measurement instrument, for example, Shannon. More sophisticated ones we can construct from that, and then we can see whether it is useful. What we are talking about is the dynamics of communication, in which we can only construct concepts that we can make useful.
If I could build on Lot's ideas there, the phrase today in science is evidence-based practice, fact-based practice, coming out of this sort of discrete testing, etc. They didn't use this phrase, but the phrase comes out of the work when you start reading the documents from the beginnings of the American experiment. And it's theory-based practice.
Yes.
Theory-based practice means you've got to get your theories of the system right first before you sit there and start moving things around and putting in checks and balances or constitutions. So check your theory-based practice first. And theory-based practice was the way they read history. By reading the radical historian Gibbons on the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, they started looking at patterns and consequences of patterns versus who's in power. Patterns versus power. That was a radical shift in what you do to design a society. So it's not denigrating existing science. That's extremely powerful. But what it limits us with and creates a blind spot because we don't have the correct theory-based practice in place And that's what we are all gathered here to do, is to try to get some guidelines, guardrails, bumpers on our theories.
And this is against materialism and historicism and people who think that we can learn from what is the case without any theoretical notion and interpretation behind it.
Mhm.
If I may, I would be most interested to hear Klaus' opinion. Or did you leave, Klaus?
Klaus?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, he's here.
Any observations?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, that didn't work.
Okay. A lot of people are muted. Jamie, you are muted.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Klaus, yeah, maybe we need to put up a sign, Klaus, that says Klaus.
Yeah. If people don't want, we shouldn't push them.
So what is interesting in this idea of the container that Jamie talks about is the idea of a constraint as impeding our freedom. And what we're talking about are boundaries that are constraint enabling, that certain constraints by the interactions of those create a higher level of complexity or evolutionary possibilities. So what is not possible on the individual psychological, individualistic level is possible because it has new degrees of freedom because of the type of enabling constraint that is provided. So our task here is to say, what's the difference between a disabling constraint and an enabling constraint? Because freedom is not possible, total freedom. The question is, what sort of prison do I want to live in and prosper in?
Yes.
So what about Lucio? Can Lucio, do you hear us? Do you have any comments?
Yes, I'm following you and trying to follow you, but I found the discussion a little bit too much confused. It was difficult for me to keep, say, point of references and say, okay, we are talking precisely about this with different definitions or about that. It's just a sort of, overlapping and crossing perspectives and also just meanings. So the point is just what Lut discussed in his presentation is probably there are rather different meanings, even if we are all, supposed to be expert into the field of cybernetics, second order cybernetics, and but then it seems that there are actually different meanings that we give to probably to the same words and same words to different issues, to different objects. So in this situation, it's extremely difficult, at least for me, to intervene. to even to get an orientation in the discussion. What I would suggest, if possible, is, in situations like this, what I would suggest is that is to find a shared concrete example. So a sort of a laboratory, no, a shared, very common, something that is that probably all of us has experienced in the past or in the present, and say, okay, let's keep this object and try to look at this object from our different perspectives. At least maybe we could share also some meaning, some reference. I mean, what somebody evoked Wittgenstein. Then the question is just to have a sort of external reference, you know, extensive language, and say, so we are referring in this situation to this object in these different ways.
But Lucio, if we take, for example, interdisciplinarity, we cannot take it as an object.
Sorry?
If you take, for example, interdisciplinarity or synergy or something like that, you can probably measure it, but you cannot see it as an object.
Okay,
Why not? Why not?
I don't know what it looks like.
okay, here I'll
But
show you what it
invoke
looks like.
you invoke differential equations and eigenvectors. Is that sort of observation different than your view of synergy?
No, I think it's a misunderstanding that these are objects. It's not the case.
No, I mean some concrete object. It's. I mean, the more abstracting we go, and the more difficult it is to understand each other. That's the point.
I proposed a credit card. The credit card is perhaps doing what you want, because there we have a concrete object which has a meaning for wealth, for my individual well-being, and which has social functions.
Loot, but I have a counterexample that shows that it doesn't work. You all may have heard about Donald Trump buying a golf course in Scotland. And so he didn't come with his credit card. Actually, he came as a negotiator. And he was a much better negotiator than the people over there. But of course, they responded. And in the end, they may have also done well. But all situations of diplomacy, they're negotiations. So we all need to become negotiators. I think it is something, a skill that is essential. And now the question is, it's an interaction. And so you cannot theorize about it, you need to do it. It's something we all need, we practice. So Lucio, so that's role-playing what you're talking about. Lucio?
Jerry Chandler speaking. This is Jerry Chandler speaking.
Hi, Jerry.
Oh, go ahead, finish, Jamie.
I just was saying role-playing, being in a room and having role-playing, so everyone can look at the role-playing and then give feedback to that.
I think we are having a very different objectives and a very different attitude towards cybernetics among us.
Yes, Lut, and this is why I would like to interject with a theoretical question, a question of broad scope and scale, a question that I think leads to a certain level of confusion in my mind about what you are trying to communicate to the group, and the level of communication you are seeking, to me, seems to be unclear and diffuse. And by this, I mean the relationship between mathematics, logic, and society. If you are going to talk of social systems, are there any constraints which you wish to place on either logic or mathematics as representations of existence? So category theory is useful or not? I mean, logic is useful or not? Boolean logic, good or bad? Rosen, good or bad?
Rosen is fantastic. It is inspiring. And I find also Shannon entropy very interesting. No, I don't see a reason why I have to make a choice.
Bernard here, I'd like to comment a little bit because we're getting locked in language yet again, use of metaphors and throwing labels around as if we all know what we're talking about. I just posted in the comment the concept from Heinz von Förster that objects, the things that we distinguish around as objects, which we have calculated or computed or whatever, or constructed as our world, these are tokens for eigenbehaviors, by which it means the habitual invariants that we encounter in our world. Our objects there because they stick around, but these are tokens. They are the things we've calculated, computed. Sorry, Peter, I can't resist using the word. And then the names of these objects, like computer and whatever, these are second order social eigenbehaviors about which we try to agree. We try to use the same labels for the same objects. Well, but, it's not an easy business to agree what on earth the objects are we are talking about. Remember, these are eigenbehaviors, but it's certainly not an easy business to agree what symbol.
Well, Bernard, this is the very essence of my question. Are objects, particularly mathematical objects or set theoretical objects, invariant, and you're drawing on that invariance, or big or here is the question, is society invariant? Is social development invariant? Is evolution invariant? Or is there a constant source of novelty, of change, of introduction of new concepts, of new ideas? This is a deep question that's not simply answered by saying that I assume category theory is a good description of nature, and Rosen's description of his notion of mathematics is a good description as opposed to a fabricated description.
Well, fine. The abstractions we find in mathematics are, for cyberneticians, according to Ashby anyway, a toolbox. We take them out and we use them. Now, to examine them in great detail, see what happens to them. If we look at the history, they have evolved. Mathematics isn't one coherent discipline. It's full of all kinds of different domains and different concepts, which people have, where you can say they've discovered invariance, and they've also invented categories to explore. I mean, it's an absolutely wonderful realm, and many of the constructs remain pretty stable, but the context can change. So we move from, for example, from Euclidean geometry into multidimensional geometry in the late 19th century. And it's an ever evolving world, and it's we, the users of these abstractions, who declare that they are, in some sense, invariants. I mean,
yes, that I agree with, Bernard.
I personally am very fond of prime numbers.
Yeah,
I think
Bernard,
it's too
I agree
difficult
with you 100% there. The question I'm actually asking is this notion of mathematics, as it is currently considered to be invariant, adequate to express the ideas and concepts that Lute is talking about?
No, certainly not.
I wrestle with those questions without having clear answers at this moment.
Mathematics,
and I think the proposal which I answered to Larry, to take, for example, and to Lucio, let's take the credit card. There you have an object which we can talk about from different perspectives.
If I could
It's
just
easier
talk
than
about what I
category.
think Lucio was saying is, and we'll be talking about this at our next end of year session, is what do we want to be talking about and how do we want to be talking about it? And what I understood, Lucio, is we need real problems to be addressing with our minds, with our theories, etc. We can be talking about what Luhmann, what Heinz, etc. have said. The question is, can we apply it to a real problem? And hopefully Alex will be here next time because he has real problems he's trying to work on. And so we need to be able to put a problem
science
amidst
policy
us.
problems. These are real problems. I'm not talking about about theoretical chimera. How do we organize interdisciplinarity? I gave that as an example. We don't know. These are real problems.
That would be a topic. How do you design an interdisciplinary, systems-oriented inquiry?
Okay,
a critical
then
theory.
the problem,
What would a critical theory look like in cybernetics?
Hello, I think a way of wrapping it up is that we formulate questions maybe in the next 5 minutes or so that can be shared in the chat room.